Yeah, that thermostat does work.
It does. Okay, so it's going to turn on heat if I crank it up.
Yep.
There's no switch for fan, so.
Do you want water?
Seems comfortable.
I could use some water, yes.
Oh.
There, yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, share one. Thanks.
Unfortunately, we don't keep wine in
Let's see.
there.
Maybe if I sit on the other side, we would have a doorway behind us. Let's see. Yeah. Better.
We run into so many people with families. Every time we introduce ourselves, they say, "Oh, do you know what this is? I have an old cookie."
Yep. My grandparents. Everything on that screen is backwards.
Pardon?
Everything on the screen is backwards.
I grew up in Washington, so it's quite a trip to get back there, so I didn't get to go very much.
Yes.
I don't know.
Especially
But
like
I
a
should have
year old baby
so.
playing.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
They made me do it once by myself when I was 8. I don't know how I did it.
So
Talk
I
about like
showed
the
me
slack giving
my
me kids
ELGL.
It's just good.
So I collect stickers from different groups. This is their sticker, the Engaging Local Government
It
Leaders.
must have been pre-9/11. My parents, like they just picked me up at the gate, I think.
But Eric, ELGL is a subgroup of ICMA. Is that right? Are they associated at all?
They're, I don't know.
Okay.
They might be independent.
All right, are we ready to get started?
I think we are.
Great. Let's do this. Welcome everyone to today's ELGL webinar. Today we'll learn more about the legacy of LP Cookingham, the man, the myth, the legend, the grandfather of city management, the OG of City Hall selfie takers. My name is Kirsten Wyatt. I'm the Executive Director of ELGL, and it's my pleasure to get things started today. As quick background, ELGL is a Big Tent local government organization, and we work to connect, communicate, and educate our members on a variety of local government topics. Today, I'm excited to welcome 3 Kansas Cityans to our ELGL webinar. Mr. Al Morrow and Mr. John Laney worked with LP Cookingham when he was the Kansas City City Manager. And Rick Usher currently is the Kansas City Assistant City Manager, and he graciously coordinated today's event. Before we begin, I want to let everyone know that your microphones and conference phones are muted, and this makes the webinar enjoyable and efficient for everyone. After our presentation has finished, we will open up for questions, and you can submit these using the chat box on the left side of your screen. We will also be live tweeting today's webinar, and you can follow along using the hashtag CookinghamConnection, and also be sure to use Rick and Kansas City's Twitter handles, RUKCMO and KCMO. We're using that hashtag also in reference to a blog series that ELGL ran a few years ago, where we had 2 ELGL members reflect each week on each of LP Cookingham's 22 guideposts for effective city management. It was an awesome series and gave some modern perspectives on the guideposts that were written in 1956. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Rick, Al, and John.
Thanks, Kirsten. Again, Rick Usher, Kansas City, Missouri, and Al Morrow. So, Al, thanks for joining us this afternoon. And John Laney will hopefully be joining us in the next 30 minutes or so. But, Al, we were talking a bit, I guess, about how you found out about the opportunity in Kansas City, and can you give us some background on how you came to find out about the opportunity?
Well, I was at the University of Connecticut in the graduate program and applied for an internship in 1952. That was about 2 weeks ago. And both John Kemich and I were both selected. So we drove out here and arrived in December 1952. He was assigned to the finance department and I was assigned to public works. Then I got drafted to go to the Korean War. So I spent about 8 months here, then left. When I returned, I went to the public works department and then eventually ended up in the budget department as a budget analyst. And then ended up becoming Cookingham's assistant in the city manager's office.
Yeah. So how long were you, how long did you work with LP?
Well, I would say as his assistant, I think for 2 years.
2 years, that's right. And doing some, you know, as an assistant city manager myself, I've been with City Hall for 32 years. And so, you know, going through, you know, the political process, and can you give us some background of some of your experiences while you were working at the city?
Well, yeah, they were very turbulent times.
Yeah.
I took on the responsibility. I recommended integrating the city public hospitals, and so Ms. Cookingham put me in charge of that. So I got my baptism of fire at about 22 years old.
22. Wow.
So approximately at that time. And those were very turbulent times. The city was not segregated at that time, you may recall. The city had 2 hospitals.
I've read about it, but yeah, and I read the paper, the presentation you gave on it. I think something that'll be significant to a lot of folks watching that are going through NPA programs now, or looking at how to work in city government and get involved in public engagement. But in reading through your paper, it seemed like every other paragraph ended with, and then all hell broke loose. So we kind of deal with that in a number of ways in city government. So how did you, you know, personally and professionally work in those situations where public engagement was so diverse?
Well, I knew I was being supported by people I worked for. Ms. Cookingham believed in the idea of integrating the hospitals. We had met with the city council at a budget meeting at the Kansas City Club, which was segregated. It was a Sunday afternoon. And at that time, we recommended, I called it consolidation, not integration. And the city manager proposed that to the city council, and they agreed with it. And so we made the decision that evening. And then the next morning, I had to go out to the hospital to explain to the doctors what we were doing. And that's when all hell broke loose.
Okay.
Because there was a black hospital and a white hospital. There were 3 hospitals, number 1, number 2, and the TB hospital, which was out at Leeds. And so I met with the medical staff that morning, and they couldn't believe we were going to propose that. Because at that time, they began to complain at the fact there weren't enough toilets. And my response was, if there are enough toilets now, why would there be not enough when we integrate? And clearly, they wanted to keep, the assumption was going to have black and white toilets. Mm-hmm. So that's when it all started. Yeah. And we ended up having a big meeting at the city hospital that one evening with the city council and the medical staff. And I was there as a young guy, and Mr. Cookingham said, Mr. Morrow will explain all of this to you. And so he simply said, so I had to take on the responsibility, and we made it very clear at that point that whatever had to be done would be done, and we hired, in conjunction with the medical staff, we agreed to hire a consultant to advise the city as to how we should go ahead with the consolidation. Mm-hmm. And I was put in charge of that by the city manager to see that through.
Yeah, that 22.
I used to be 6 feet tall.
I think I've heard you say that before. Yeah. So I was lucky to work with you during the Focus initiative. Yes. You led the infrastructure citywide infrastructure group. Yes. There. for those of you watching, FOCUS is an acronym for Forging Our Comprehensive Urban Strategy, and it's Kansas City's comprehensive plan. Can you talk a little bit about, I guess, that civic engagement, what that meant to the city at the time?
I really don't recall the specifics of that.
Okay.
I'm 88 years old. My memory is not as good as it used to be.
Okay. Well, I understand. So the time that you spent at city government, then I know you had a long career in civic engagement in the city and with different companies in the city. So your experience with Cookingham, with the Kansas City administration, how did that help you in your career in Kansas City?
Well, I think it helped me because, first of all, as a young person, I was given this responsibility, and I knew I had the backing as a city manager and the city council. And I think you learn to at least be aware of the fact that there are more than one ways to look at a problem. And the best way to get it done is to try to find a common cause for it. So you don't get it done by always having confrontation, but you can't also compromise yourself either. So there was that delicate balance always in terms of when do you compromise and when do you stay with your principles. And there was no question at all that we weren't going to compromise the fact that we wanted to integrate the hospitals. I called it consolidation because the city was segregated at that time. They had separate swimming pools and separate facilities. The schools were separate. So you simply had to maneuver yourself through those very, very difficult circumstances.
So when you left city government, and so you came from Connecticut, but so you chose to stay in Kansas City.
Yes.
So where did you go next?
Well, I was here when Mr. Cookingham was asked to leave, and I stayed on as assistant to Mr. Reed McKinley, who was the director of public works, who then became city manager, and I was his assistant at that time. And a major incident occurred where he was informed by the mayor that they wanted him to relieve the public health director, and I disagreed with that. And so when I heard that was going to happen, I had made contact with the medical society to inform them what was going to occur, and they were really upset with that. And there was a major confrontation between the medical community and the city hall about that, making that move. But then I resigned, and then I became assistant director of the Housing Urban Renewal Agency.
Okay.
I moved right across the street to their offices.
Okay.
And I stayed there until I joined Community Studies, a research organization. And that's when I was asked to take on the responsibility to take the city hospitals away from the city, set up a not-for-profit corporation. I became the first executive director of the General Hospital Corporation, right, which is now Truman Medical Center.
Yeah, Truman is a large operation now.
So I organized that transfer from the city to the not-for-profit corporation, became the first executive director.
Okay. So you briefly used the phrase Cookingham was asked to leave, and as city administrators, we find ourselves in those positions where the council or the public disagree with the positions of the city manager. I have been through one transition in Kansas City. Could you describe that, what that experience was like when Cookingham was asked to leave and then you were asked to stay on? That is a career crisis, I think, that when you look at these things, and it is something that city managers have to deal with. It's like a fun job until there's 6 votes against you, right?
Well, I think it was very clear that if they didn't retire, they were going to force him to leave. I forget what the exact circumstance was, but he left and went down to Fort Worth to eventually become city manager of Fort Worth.
Okay.
But no, and I was asked to stay on, and I had worked for Mr. McKinley because when I first arrived here, as an intern, I was in the Public Works Department. So I knew him and had a respect for him. And I was surprised when he accommodated the move of the health director. And I decided I couldn't stay in those circumstances.
Yeah.
I just quietly retired.
Right. At how old were you at that point?
I must have been probably maybe 30. I'm not really sure.
30, so not quite retiring.
No.
But moving on to a new point of your career. So Cookingham is famous for his guideposts, advice to city managers. And are you familiar with those and how he formulated?
He had a great belief in finding young people, developing them into professionals. And when we put together the budget, in those days we didn't have all the fancy computers, and so we'd work here at nighttime, and he'd be here. Mm-hmm. And so he would always invite us to make sure we were all taken care of. So he was always, in fact, when you were in the budget department, occasionally you'd be asked to attend a city council meeting. And so you always had to make sure you had a necktie and a jacket, because you couldn't go to the top floor without a necktie and a jacket. Right. And so you always made sure you had one of those available.
Right, and that's standard attire. I think I sleep in this. I don't know if people joke about that, but and so he's known in city manager circles as the godfather of the city manager form of government, and he took those principles with him to Fort Worth. But 17-year career in Kansas City, is that correct? 1940 to
I think it was approximately 17 years during the Prendergast era, lasted until he was not going to be able to serve that city council,
which is that's a good run.
Unusual
for a city manager. Well, let me see. The leadership style then that he used, do you see him more as a stronger leader or manager?
He was both. He had this capacity for finding the right time to propose a change. Because I'll remember that he always waited for the right opportunity to act. He didn't pick the wrong time. He would wait for a crisis to develop, and all of a sudden he would be able to announce what he thought might be a solution. Right. Because the situation was such that they had to find some kind of a solution. So he had this capacity for knowing when the right time was to propose something. But I think it was an innate thing in him. Yeah, it was really remarkable.
And that sounds like a good survival skill, if you guys are listening, for a city manager to have.
Yeah.
Like, know the temperament of your council, the public, and that's so the term whiz kids, did that apply to you and others that came along at the time?
I think we referred to the whiz kids at times.
Yeah.
But we were all quite young. We had the respect of the city council, which was interesting, because we would appear and we prepared to study. We had no agenda. Our responsibility was to be as independent as we could. The city manager very respected the opinion of the budget department, and we had great opportunities as young people to attend these meetings, which was really quite an opportunity for us to be there at a meeting. But he also had this great skill socially. Mr. Cookingham had social skills that were really unmatched, honestly. Yeah. And I'm not really sure that I can describe all the times he knew how to be a very gracious person. But he could also be very principled in how he approached things.
So when eventually he retired to Kansas City.
Yes,
he returned to Kansas City. Did you know him then? Or
yes. I saw him quite often. he took the responsibility, he took position as Crown Center.
Okay.
At Hallmark.
Yeah.
He, I can't recount all the times we would meet, because we had a very active public administration group in Kansas City.
Mm-hmm.
It was sort of we were not a closed society, but we all got together, and he was always available to the young people. He was a great raconteur. He loved to be sharing opinions with people.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Well, I know one story I heard was that, near KCI we have LP Cookingham Road, and when Public Works put the signs up, they put NW for Northwest because of the way we name our streets. And he called the Public Works director and said, "That's LP," and so we changed the signs back. But and that brings up the annexations. So Cookingham really, did he lead the effort towards those? Because the annexations came later after he had left.
No, he led the annexation battles. First of all, that was quite an accomplishment on his part.
Mm-hmm.
And he had the help of Tom Gavin and others, but he really made the decision to put the airport out there. Yeah. And they had options to put it south of the city also. But the decision was to put it there because he thought that was the best place for the airport. But he wanted to make sure the city controlled the land around the airport.
Right, and that's really helping us today. So, and you're following the issues with KCI today.
Yeah.
You've been involved in those conversations.
I'm not involved in those conversations, but I think that the decision to make the change is critically important. I think it's the right decision. Yeah. I think that the three terminal decision was one before we had all the issues about security. Yeah. And they simply not working. From my point of view is, if I were in business right now, I would not be that happy with having trouble.
Yeah, and on that, I've talked to a number of people who grew up in Kansas City, whose families worked for TWA, and Kansas Cityans who were able to travel really globally because of TWA and that base of operations out of KCI. So, but seeing where we are today versus then, do you have any views on it?
Well, as I understand it, the configuration of those buildings is such that it cannot accommodate the large aircraft anyway at the present time.
Yeah.
And I wasn't aware of that, but apparently that's correct. So I don't really know what the advantage is right now, because the downtown airport is really very convenient.
Uh-huh.
And I think the idea was that when they built the new terminals, they have all the conveniences, but they couldn't afford to put three separate restaurants in, and three separate buildings, because the restaurants were major gathering places for people when the airport was downtown.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But that's a minor issue. I think that the whole issue of security is a critical one.
Right. Kirsten, are we getting any questions online, or do you have any comment?
I'm muted.
Well, just as a reminder to our guests to use that chat bar to ask your questions. But I'm interested to know, we do have a lot of students listening in to today's webinar. And so reflecting back on your career, Mr. Morrow, what was one thing that you did right at the start of your career that has kind of stayed with you through your entire working professional life and even today? Was it a skill or an aptitude or a talent that you brought with you to the working world that you would recommend to others?
Well, I guess the one attribute was to listen before you speak. I think that the important thing was that we were very fortunate that we had an environment in the budget department that really gave us the opportunity to be exposed to a series of conditions we had great responsibility, but also had to recognize the fact that we couldn't go off half-cocked with recommendations. We had to be able to support our recommendations with the facts. And so Mr. Cookingham relied upon the budget department to be able to support the recommendations that were included in the budget. And as young people, it was really quite an environment for us. I really can't describe it any better than that. But we weren't treated as clerks. We weren't treated as minions. We were treated as a responsible part of the process. And the city council people respected our opinions because Mr. Cookingham always would call on to invite somebody to a pre-council meeting. And if you were invited to that meeting, he would call on you as the expert, so-called, to speak to a certain matter. So that's a great responsibility to give a young person. But
yeah, well, so Julie Steenson and Eric Roach are here from our performance management office, and I'm sure what you're talking about is of interest to them because today we have access to huge amounts of data electronically, collected by a number of means. How did you assemble data and information during those times in order to make these decisions and go forward?
Well, when I was assistant to the city manager, we had to prepare all of the information that went to the city council. So we had to write up all the summaries of all the ordinances. We didn't do them with data, with all electronic data. So you had to sit there and prepare a summary that couldn't be more than 1 page long. I learned one thing in the city manager's office. His instructions were no letter should be more than 1 page long. So you had to learn to put in one letter everything you're going to say to the respondent. First of all, what your decision was, your reason for the decision. If you have any questions, call. So I learned early on to summarize everything on 1 page. And that's a great discipline because he insisted on that. So then you had to prepare the summary of the ordinances. We did those for each ordinance that went to city council. We didn't have all the fancy procedures we have right now. They had to be written out. The secretary would type them up. And then at the end of a council meeting, you have to go back to the office and dictate into your dictating machine what your next course of it before you could leave to go home for the evening. And there was much discipline that he insisted on. And you learn that early on that you need to make sure that you had everything in order. When I was assistant to the city manager, the Kansas City Star reporter would call me on a Saturday morning at my apartment saying he saw something on Mr. Cookingham's desk. Could I explain that? Because Mr. Cookingham would leave stuff on his desk purposely so the reporter could see have something to write for the weekend. Yeah. So I would explain to them, knowing full well that he had the right to see what he left there. If he didn't want to see it, he would have hidden it in his desk. Mm-hmm. But he was very clever in terms of how he communicated with the public. But those are sort of, I would say, tricks. It was something he had learned over the years. He had the great respect for the press. When I was here, the press had an office outside of the city manager's office on the 29th floor. And that's where the Kansas City Star and all the news reporters. The Kansas City Star had reporters for the morning paper and the afternoon paper.
Kristen, someone has a mic on.
Oh, I apologize. I think it was me. Another question came in, but
okay. I had just so Kansas City has had a city manager form of government for, I guess, did that come about right before Cookingham came in? And
oh yes, well there was a city manager. There was a city manager during the Prendergast area,
McElroy,
who was controlled by Mr. Prendergast.
So there, we still have today the city manager form of government that we have in Kansas City, and then we have strong mayor governments. And if you have any opinion, one way or the other, on those forms of
Well, I'll have to say that being brought up in the church, I would say that I still believe in the city manager form of government. I may be one of the few people left, but I do think there's a need for professional management, and I think you may have to jiggle with it a bit, but there's a great benefit to have a professionalism installed in the government. And if you're not right, even though with the city manager form of government, when you have a change in mayor, they can always get rid of the city manager, which they've done here. We've had some very bad experiences with city managers in Kansas City. In fact, Mr. Weatherford, who was city manager when the transfer of the city hospitals occurred, he happened to at least be willing to listen to a proposal to consider transferring the hospitals from the city to a not-for-profit corporation. But he was not a professional city manager. He had formerly been the mayor of Independence, Mr. Weatherford. I think that's correct. He became city manager.
Did we have a city manager who was had a term of maybe a week or a month?
I think we had a few of those.
I've heard some of those stories. So
I'm not sure it's a week or a month, but it wasn't very long.
Yeah. Okay. Kirsten, did you say another question came in?
Sure, and this is a great question. This is from Kenton Tigard, and he wants to know, with all of the talk about a new Amazon headquarters, he wants to know about Mr. Cookingham's approach to economic development.
So in business attraction, Amazon is seeking a city to open their second headquarters.
Well, I assume that proposal is a serious one that the city is proposing to Amazon.
Yeah.
And that the city manager, as well as the Chamber of Commerce, are intimately involved with that. So I think that the key element of the city manager is to help the civic leadership put together the best proposal they can. That includes what kind of incentives you're going to propose and whether you can afford those incentives.
Were there any business attraction events like that during the Cookingham administration that you are aware of? TWA was here prior to. They've been.
Yeah, they were here, but the decision to go put the new airport in was a key one.
Mm-hmm.
That was a major civic investment. And I'd have to think a bit about the others.
Okay.
Hallmark has been a major investment in Kansas City.
Yes.
And the investment to do the renewal around the Kansas City terminal, which also involved Hallmark, was a major decision. And that was a major urban renewal project. The development of Hospital Hill, Ms. Cookingham was not city manager then, but those are sort of an offshoot of the program that she put in place. So, urban renewal was a major program in Kansas City, which he supported.
In Hospital Hill and the Hallmark development, Hallmark Crown Center, if those of you are familiar with Kansas City, Crown Center, Hallmark Manufacturing, their corporate headquarters are in a part of downtown that was now called Crown Center. And prior to that, it was called Signboard Hill.
Yes.
And basically littered with huge outdoor advertising
with a big signboard. And Mr. Hall wanted to redevelop Crown Center, and that required major support from the city.
Right, Kirsten?
What about Kansas City today would surprise Mr. Cookingham the most, and then what would also surprise him the least?
Well, I think What was surprising the least, I think, is still this major battle taking place between Kansas City, Missouri, and Kansas about how to properly develop a metropolitan area. And if you look at the whole issue about public transit, I think there should be some way to develop a public transit system that serves the whole metropolitan area. The constant competition between Russian industry settlers would be in Kansas City, Missouri, or on the Kansas side. Hopefully there's no battle about the airport. But there's also been discussion about maybe developing a separate airport over in Kansas. Doesn't seem to make any sense to me, but I think they should all concentrate on the fact of having a quality airport that serves the metropolitan region.
Governor Brownback had proposed an airport on the Kansas side, but the terminal replacement is like $1 billion project. An entire airport complex of that size would be, I'm talking aviation, a $5, maybe $6 billion investment. So, and a big shift in the region.
Yeah, I would suspect that's not going to take place.
No, and now. And so I think what you're talking about, this regional cooperation, and I've been involved in some of our Amazon efforts, that when they're looking at a region and they're bringing 50,000 jobs, it is starting to have these ripple effect discussions that population, that employee population, is going to live throughout the region.
Yeah.
So. And it's been described, I guess our economic development border wars have been described as a race to the bottom. So we support that argument. That,
well, I think they're going to have to get together and make sure that they come up with a proposal they all support. You can't be competing amongst yourselves to appeal to Amazon. If Amazon thinks you're competing with amongst yourselves, that's not going to help.
Right. So, Mr. Cookingham was struggling with those efforts back in his administration as well?
I'm sure he did, yes. But basically, at that time, we didn't have a lot of the development taking place over in Johnson County as it is now.
Mm-hmm.
The major problem we had was that you had a very thriving downtown, and all of a sudden, before you knew it, you were arguing about one-way street systems to find an easy way for people to get home at night, rather than being concerned about was that the smartest thing for the city to have. What they should have been looking at is, well, how do you make it easy to stay downtown rather than leaving downtown?
Yeah, and that's kind of, we've gone, I think, full circle on that. I've lived in Kansas City since 1985, and back then, Town Pavilion had just opened with kind of a shopping mall feel to it, and then that went away, and it's mainly office use. But so in the last 10, it's really come back, 15 years, I guess, as a residential growing. So
yeah, but when I chaired the downtown council, I'm the one who proposed putting back the streets to become two-way streets rather than one-way streets. And I said, you might as well make them a two-way street and allow people to park on the street.
Right, and so that is still a priority, and hopefully you're seeing that we are converting more streets back to two-way traffic, and we're adding bike lanes.
Yeah,
and we're seeing some bike lanes come in because the population that's moving downtown is more interested in walking and biking. So
because a lot of the decisions were driven by the traffic department. They wanted to move cars rather than what's best for the economic development of the city.
Right. So you have the perspective of Kansas City when we had a viable streetcar system.
Oh yes, I was a big proponent of the streetcar system. Yeah. I took a streetcar from when I lived on the plaza to come down to City Hall. Yeah.
So did you own a car?
Eventually got a car, yes.
And so you actually could live in Kansas City without a car at that time, correct? So
Take the
that's,
bus, take a
no,
short
Eric doesn't have a car, so. Yeah. Kirsten, are there additional questions?
I'm muted.
So you talk about having to, sum up budget proposals in a one-page document. How would Mr. Cookingham react if you presented him with something longer or more detailed? How did he express, displeasure or when you maybe had done something wrong or incorrectly?
So the one-page memos, how would Cookingham react if you brought him something longer or in greater detail, or basically when you disagreed, what was that experience like?
We didn't disagree. We simply found a way to accommodate. I mean, the point is you were disciplined to summarize everything on one page. You can put attachments to a letter, but the key thing was to make sure you could think things through. We were taught to be able to put every complex matter on one piece of paper. If you had to draw a diagram, and be able to think it out. If you couldn't do it, you couldn't think it out, then you hadn't thought it out. So I don't know if that makes any sense at all, but you should be able to express yourself clearly on a diagram so you can explain to yourself and to others what you were proposing. So you knew who the actors were, who their responsibilities were, what actions you had to take. So you do the same thing, summarizing it on one page of a letter. And his secretary wouldn't let a letter couldn't go out, even though he didn't sign it. If you signed that letter, it couldn't go out because it didn't meet those criteria. Right? It was pretty simple. So everyone was disciplined to think that way. Mm-hmm. And I always thought that was immediate. I learned something from that. Right now, even now, I don't do anything more than a one-page letter.
Yeah, that's a good practice. And
I'm muted.
just in the situation we're in today and responding to Amazon, studying Jeff Bezos's practices, he limits his staff to a 2-page memo, but no more than 2 pages, and he despises PowerPoints. So that is excellent advice, knowing how to edit your thoughts and be brief and to the point.
I was taught don't talk past the money.
Exactly, that's kind of where I was going with that. Yeah, don't talk past the sale, don't talk past the money, and yeah, if you say in your opening potential.
If you want to know more, let them ask questions. You can answer the questions.
Yeah. So
here's a great question that just came in.
Okay.
What were some of the personal habits of Mr. Cookingham that made him so effective? What did he like to read, and did he have any hobbies?
I'm not sure what he liked to read, but he was a well-read man. His hobbies, I think, were management. But he was a great social animal. He loved to be with people. He could be with people he didn't agree with, but he never was.
Okay, I'm sorry, John. Hold on a second. I'll get to you. John's been getting
But he had a capacity of being able to go out and meet with people. When I was his assistant, he would say, "Al, let's go to lunch." So we get in his car and we drive out somewhere, and he said, "We're going to go see so and so, somebody who complained about a matter." And we'd arrive at that person's door, and the city manager would ring the doorbell and say he was there and he wanted to answer their complaint. And so and he was surprised, this resident, here arriving at maybe noontime to answer his complaint about a problem that was in his neighborhood. And I learned a lot from that because he would communicate with that person one-to-one. Then he'd go back to the office and and tell the department to get the problem taken care of. Then he'd follow up to see whether it was taken care of or not. There was a famous incident, an incident I never forgotten. That somebody called one day complaining about the fact that his street light was out in front of his house. Mr. Cookingham, he called Mr. Cookingham at his home, maybe 11 o'clock, telling him the street light was out. So the next morning, he called the Public Works Department, told them that the street light was out to get it fixed. So the next night, Mr. Cookingham called and said, "This is Mr. Cookingham." He said, "What are you calling me this night?" He said, "Well, is your light on?" He said, "You called me last night." So they became very good friends after that. But I thought that was quite an interesting experiment on his part to make sure that he had a great sense of humor. He really had an amazing sense of humor. And you had to make sure when he was being humorous and when he was not being humorous at all. But he had this capacity about him to be able to relate to people, which was really quite an experience to see him operate.
Mm-hmm. So John Laney is what I'm trying to do now is get the garage open for him, and he'll be joining us here in a few moments. Eric went down to do that. So.
So we have another question about if Mr. Morrow has a favorite Cookingham guidepost, and during his time working for the city, did those guideposts work their way down through staff, and was that something that you lived and worked each day when you were with the city?
Yeah. We at ELGL had city manager staff across the country write articles on how we interpret the guideposts. I don't know if those, you've touched on some of the points, just on his humble nature.
Yeah, I've not seen these before, but I'm certain that these represent his guideposts. And just looking at them, this is the way he operated. There's no question about that at all.
I didn't quite print it on one page, but if I get the graphic off of there, then maybe that would have been a one pager.
Well, you can't put 22 items on one page.
Right. Yeah. So the one that I wrote about was always taking the chip off the complainant's shoulder before leaving an argument or a complaint. Do you have experience with that? Or
yeah, well, he was open. He made himself open to the citizenry. And the example I gave you of the calling in about the street light being out, he didn't turn him off. He simply said, "Well, make sure you're taken care of." And then he had this sense of humor to make sure he called him back that day. And they became very good friends after that. And this was a person who called him because for some reason he didn't like Mr. Cookingham. All of a sudden, convert him to be a big supporter of his. He had this capacity for doing that.
So today we have Twitter, and Troy Schulte, our city manager, the mayor, other city staff, we will receive those type of complaints directly to the phone, like a text message, and so there is still this higher level of cooperation. So and that kind of leads toward Kansas City. We're a large city, but we're a small city, small town at the same time. So I think we're kind of in a good spot there for citizen engagement, or?
Yeah, but I'm not really sure. I'm not really sure you can solve every problem immediately.
Right.
Some problems are best to sort of fester for a bit before you find a solution. So to expect that every time you've got a problem, to expect it to be solved at that moment is really not a fair expectation. Right? That may be difficult to explain to people, but there's certain times you have to make sure you think them through before you react automatically.
Mm-hmm. I think that reminds me of Julie on our data analysis of the time it took to fix fire hydrant leaks. Was that a big one a few years back?
Water main breaks.
Water main breaks. Yeah. So, okay, Mr. Laney has joined us. Hello, John. Sorry about
Hello,
the
John.
confusion there at the door. If you'd have a seat here, I can get you on camera with us. And we have Kirsten Wyatt with ELGL on the call. And if you could move, and I'll move the camera over here a bit.
Okay.
Then, hello. So we've just been talking about Mr. Morrow's experiences with Mr. Cookingham and Kansas City, and I know that you became closer to him, I guess, after his experience, after he came back to Kansas City. So you want to introduce yourself and talk a bit about your career.
Yeah, well,
and how you came to be part of the Cookingham gang.
sure. Well, I was in 1979. I was asked by Bob Kipp to come to town and be the assistant city manager for planning and development, which I did. And so I was here then for 10 years. And during that time, toward the off and on through that entire time, I got to know Perry a little bit. But Al knows him a lot more, knew him a lot more, because Al really worked for him and was a part of the management team, important part of the management team that really got a lot of things done here in Kansas City, and it was amazing. And so I know some secondhand things through Al mostly, but I assume he's already had the chance to do that. It's appropriate I get here at the last minute because it was kind of the last minute of Perry's career that I had some association with him. He'd probably be a little mad this morning. He was kind of an impatient guy, wouldn't you say, Al? And he would probably say, "Oh, sure, this is no damn way to run a railroad."
Right.
And then he'd say, "How come it took Laney so long to get from Brookside to here? You got to speed up those traffic lights along there. Retime them," he would say. Yeah. Well, his impatience was one of his good things, actually. He was impatient to get things done. He was urgent about getting things done, and he wanted to make it right, and he did do that. My relationship with him really came through Bob Kipp, who was city manager at the time, and Bob was kind of looking after Perry in his last years, and he was lived in a nursing home, not really a nursing home, it's an independent living senior home in South Kansas City, and not too far from where I lived at that time. And so Bob would ask me, Perry still liked to come downtown and do some of the things that the city manager used to do when he was city manager, and go to the Kansas City Club was his favorite thing. And so he asked me to come down, and Bob would ask me to pick him up and take him in, because it really wasn't safe for him to drive at that point. And Bob was also trying to get him off of alcohol a little bit. He liked to imbibe occasionally. And so one day in particular, I was asked to pick him up, and I did. And we chatted, and he fussed at me anytime I would pull 6 inches over the white line at a traffic light. Well, he would fuss at me for doing that. And then we got downtown. We went to the Kansas City Club, and of course it was the Owl Club, and there were all these folks in there. And the Owl Club was named after the last streetcar that left Kansas City in the afternoon. So all these people that worked downtown, including the city manager, go over there, and they'd spend until 6:30 or so. Probably Harriet would call down there and want to find out where he was, Anyway, he would. So he went in there, and he had a martini, of course, and everybody was smoking cigars at the time in the Owl Club, so he said, "Do you want one?" I said, "Sure, Perry, I'd like to have one." So I had one, and it was so good we had two, and then suddenly it dawned on me that I had missed a meeting with Bob Kipp that we had scheduled for 7:30 or 1:30 in the city manager's office, and I was horrified. And he says, "Don't you worry about it, John, I'll write you a note." And so he wrote me a note: "Dear Mr. Kipp, please excuse John Laney. He was with me, taking care of me, and making sure I had a good time at the Kansas City Club. Sincerely yours, LP Cookingham." And I've lost that note. I wish I hadn't, because I've lost that note over the years. So the other thing was that Perry would constantly call me at least twice a month to complain about the signs to going to the airport. And the signs at the airport, if you're familiar with that, there's Cookingham Drive up there, which is a wonderful thing that they were named the street after him. And it's Northeast Cookingham Drive, so on the sign it says N.E. Cookingham. And he would call me and he would complain. He says, "Have you done anything about that sign to get it right?" And at first I said, "Well, what do you mean by right?" He said, "Well, my name's L.P. Cookingham, not N.E. Cookingham, and I want to see L.P. up there." And I actually did. I worked with the State Highway Department and tried to get them to, see that this was an important thing to Mr. Cookingham, and they would have no part of it. They said, "We don't do names like that." So those are my two Cookingham stories. He was a really interesting person. I've read a lot about him, of course, and all the incredible things that he did when he arrived in Kansas City the first time and was put into the. And I've recently done some reading from the library of the Truman Library, in which they were describing the political scene at that time. With the different political bosses that were in place just before he got here, and to hear, and these are first-person recordings that they have stored at the library, and I was reading a manuscript of one of those, and it was just so much worse when you hear it in person from somebody who lived through it. The situation that he had when he arrived here was unimaginably bad in terms of corruption and all the things that you hear about. But you hear about them in sort of an academic sense. To go to the Truman Library and check out some of those tapes and to hear people actually describe what went on is horrifying. And it's even more horrifying to hear today sometimes. People hark back to those times as being really good days in Kansas City. Well, there were good days if you were right with the political bosses. If you weren't, why, it wasn't good days for anybody. So that's my contribution.
Those are tough times.
Very tough times.
Tough times.
Yeah.
The friendly got people, not the easiest people to get along with.
No, I'm sure. And I guess you told them about where the whiz kids lived in Kansas City, didn't you?
Fill us in on that.
Well, Al is the one that's the expert. He told me, but when, of course, when Cookingham came, he realized that he couldn't do it all himself, and he needed some smart people around him, and so he recruited from around the country to find the smartest available people who knew something about municipal government that he could, and Al Morrow was one of them that he found. I don't know all of them. Al could name their names, and they called them the Whiz Kids, and they all lived in a place over in the Plaza District. It's an apartment building that still stands there today. In fact, I came by it as I was coming up here from Brookside today, and they pretty much lived together. And I guess it was like 24/7 management because they lived together and they discussed. That was what they discussed over beers in the late nights when they would get home from the office. So you might elaborate on that.
I happened to live separately from them, but I knew where they were.
Yeah.
They were married. I was not married. So
that's right. They were the married.
They were the married ones. Yeah. So I lived in the Casa Loma.
Yeah.
At that time, but he was a great supporter of all the young people. He loved to have them around him. You can see. I'll never forget one day about 5 o'clock. He came into my office and said, "There's a traffic jam on Southwest Trafficway. Take care of it." So I called the city engineer. I said, "What the hell is going on?" He said, "Well, I said, "There's a traffic jam." So I got in my car and went out there, and he said, "Oh, we're in trouble." And what they stopped, they blocked the south-going traffic way to make it one lane. The traffic was piled up. And I said, what are you doing? They said, well, I guess Mr. Cookingham's called. I said, he sure as hell has called. I said, open this up. And he said, what? So he said to me later, he said, what do you think they were doing? And they know what the traffic, there was the traffic hour, and you don't want to hold up the traffic. But he had this capacity for making sure he was on top of everything. Then he would deal with major issues, but the minor issues, he instilled in everybody, they were very, very important.
Right, and they are important. I think that's an important lesson to learn from modern city managers. You know, you have to have command of details. You can't just be the big picture only, but yet you have to be the big picture. You have to lead in terms of the longer term issues that are facing the community, and particularly in physical planning. I think that was an area where he excelled, and it's an area all too often today that city managers are weak in that area. And you can see that result in some communities as a result of the city manager being weak. Of course, the city manager doesn't make all the decisions about the planning issues of the community, but they can certainly guide those. And it's incumbent upon city managers to know something about planning and not just push it off on planners. Not that there's anything wrong with planners. I guess I was sort of a planner myself, although my staff here at City Hall, one person he liked to say, well, we used to have a department head who, I can't remember what he put it now, but it was to the effect that that he had a lot of ideas, but couldn't get anything done. Now we have a guy who can get a lot done. He doesn't have any ideas. So that was kind of a joke. Maybe not so much a joke, but I was running the planning department, but I wasn't really a planner, and that's a dangerous thing to do. I was also an assistant city manager, which, you know, meant that they had to deal with me a little bit in the rest of the bureaucracy. So it was fun.
Yeah. So there are a number of folks viewing our NPA programs right now.
Yeah.
Do you have some advice for these people starting out in their careers in public administration? Where they
I congratulate them for wanting to get into it. I mean, it's not a simple thing, and it seems to me more complicated. I'm not sure I could do very well in today's atmosphere, but I thank them for wanting to do that, and I hope that they will continue on that path. I mean, I was 25 years as a city manager, and I wouldn't trade a second of that. I loved every minute of it. Had all kinds of opportunities, and particularly in the planning area. It's kind of a favorite area of mine, and I spent a lot of time in that when I was first worked for Bob Kipp. Bob Kipp was my mentor, still is, and has been all that time, and is a wonderful person to learn from. And I think that's a tip that I would give, and that is find someone who really knows what they're doing and intern under them, or somehow latch on to those people and learn from them. And that's what people did with Perry. And that's what people have done with Bob Kipp, a lot of them. Unfortunately for me, I was one of those. And so that's led to a lot of great things for me and a lot of insight into how you manage a city. It takes courage to do that. A lot of times you have to make decisions that aren't popular. They aren't decisions perhaps even that the city council are in love with, but you have to do a certain amount of persuasion with the political leadership, and you have to take into account that they expect you to give them a certain amount of guidance, and you should be not timid about doing that. It's a wonderful, wonderful field, and I think anyone that enters it is in for an interesting and interesting life. And the money's getting a little bit better than it used to be. I'll tell you that.
So, Kristen, are there any questions?
I think one last question would be, if you had a favorite story to tell about Mr. Cookingham, what would it be? And it doesn't necessarily have to be work related, or it can be.
Well, I told those are my two favorite stories. I mean, there are other little things, but those were my favorite stories. I mean, they were, to me, there was an insight into his personality, and I think those characteristics weren't just new to him as he aged. They were things that he carried with him through his management career.
Well, I've given you my favorite stories, although I remember when he finally left City Hall, he invited me out to his home to ask me what I wanted out of his files. So I was given the opportunity to indicate what I'd like to keep out of his files. But he was a great mentor, and although there is one other story. I'm a native of New Haven, Connecticut. I was going home to visit my family, and Mr. Cookingham was going back to Yale University to be in a program. So he decided that we should go together. So we went to the airport, and I went first class. And we arrived in New York, and then rented a car and drove into New Haven. But that was very gracious of him to change his schedule so he could accommodate my schedule. So we got to New Haven. I went to my home, and he went to Yale.
That kind of reminds me of a story about Bob Kipp, and just quickly tell it relates to that. When he left city management and moved to Crown Center, where he was the head of Crown Center development here, closely associated with Hallmark cards and so on. And he hadn't been there long, and he had to take a flight someplace, and they were going to a meeting, and I think Don Hall, the chairman of the board, and the son of the founder, was going to the meeting also. And so they handed him his ticket, and it was first class, and he gave it back to his assistant, and he said, no, I do not fly first class. This is just not done. I can't do that, and I'd like for you to change this to, the other grade, the lowest grade of ticket. And she said, Mr. Kipp, I think you'll want to travel with Mr. Hall, and Mr. Hall will be in first class. So Bob said, okay, well, I guess I'll have to take the first class ticket. Just an indication of the care with which somebody takes when they're spending public money, and it carries over into their private lives and into their non-public careers as well.
All right, and I wanted to just put out there to some of our classes of students and some of our other attendees, if there are any last questions for Mr. Laney and Mr. Morrow, now's a great time to ask them.
Yeah, while we're waiting, you talked about the hours of work. So working into the late evenings, like what was a typical day like for Mr. Cookingham? Was he at the office at 8? Or?
Oh, yes. He was there at 8 every day.
He expected you to be there.
He expected you to be there. He expected you to be there at 5 o'clock also.
And later it sounded.
Oh, yes. During the city council meetings, we were there until sometimes 8 o'clock in the evening, finishing up to make sure we had all the records taken care of.
Yeah.
So you didn't have any social life until you were able to leave.
Yeah, he really didn't see hours. I mean, he realized he was city manager 24 hours a day, and a lot of that time he wanted to be working and accomplishing things. That was his thing. He wanted to get things done.
In fact, he had a capacity for making sure that he would call his directors 8 o'clock in the morning for whatever reason to make sure. He always had a reason to call them. One way to make sure they were at the best.
And what was the assistant that he fired? The assistant always said that that was a badge of honor. But he always said that I was fired by him. I remember that,
but he got fired by him. But he also became a big supporter of him.
Yeah.
But he had to teach him a lesson.
Yeah, I can't remember the name either.
I don't remember his name, but he was
subsequently was city manager of Cincinnati.
Yes.
Yeah.
But he fired him.
Wild Bill, they called him. That's all I can think of his name. But anyway, that was always a point of pride for him that was fired by LP Cookingham and managed to be successful anyway.
Well, I think that the Wild Bill story is a great note to end this webinar on. I want to thank all of you for participating and sharing your time with us today and with ELGL members. And as a reminder, we do record all of our webinars, and we'll have this available this afternoon on elgl.org. And we also use the hashtag Cookingham Connection on Twitter. And so you can take a look at that to review and share your thoughts from the discussion. And I also want to share that we are hosting a special webinar on the Cookingham Knoll Fellowship later on November 1st. And this is an opportunity for people to learn from the current fellows about this amazing opportunity to work in Kansas City. And again, that will be on November 1st at 10 o'clock Pacific time. And you'll get to hear directly from the current fellows about what being a Cookingham Knoll Fellow means. And you can find registration details about that webinar at elgl.org or in the members only ELGL Facebook group. And so with that, I'll end today's webinar, and thank you again for joining us and for sharing your stories and your perspectives with ELGL today.
Thank you, Kristen.